What's up, fish friends? I'm Michael with Fresh Flow Aquatics. Hope you're having a terrific day. I'm excited to be talking about floating plants today. They are a true powerhouse when it comes to keeping a planted aquarium. I absolutely love them. I'll cover some pros and cons to keeping them today because as amazing as there certainly are a few cons to keeping them. I'll also go over my 3 favorite species and then talk about what you need to do in order to keep some healthy floating plants and a few things that can affect them in a negative way. Let's start this off on a positive note and talk about the pros of keeping floating plants. So, the one most important thing that I think about floating plants is their ability to clean and filter the water. Floating plants have the ability to grow super quick, which means that they need to uptake tons of nutrients. When your fish poop or release ammonia into the water, things break down, then these floating plants are going to absorb all those nutrients. So I own an aquarium maintenance business, and on clients that don't want me to be coming over often to do water changes, I kind of tailor my tanks towards that, keep them like a bit of a lower light level, like you're seeing in this tank with all these floating plants, and that helps to hold things over so that I can come over once a month or once every other month. The second most valuable aspect to keeping floating plants, in my opinion, is that they provide excellent habitat. So there are some species like chili rasboras or a lot of dwarf rainbows like the blue-eyes or Gertrudes that stress out in high light situations. So floating plants, especially in combination with stem plants, are a great way to provide a dynamic shaded habitat. So, you know, if I just had floating plants covering this whole tank, there wouldn't really be any light going down for these stem plants, which provides a lot of this vertical habitat here, whereas these floating plants provide habitat along the top. So these rainbows spend a ton of time swimming around up towards the top where the stems wouldn't necessarily give them much habitat, but the roots that hang down and the leaves that block the shade, they really do help. And even beyond creating that dynamic habitat, the floating plants help to recreate a natural habitat that these fish come from in the wild. And for fish that are likely to get stressed out easily, that's such a great way to help them feel at home. It can help to encourage breeding and other sorts of natural behaviors that most aquarists want to see in their fish. Something that you hear a lot that people talk about is aeration. So floating plants will help to put oxygen in the water. While that might be true in some cases, that's not always true. Like the plants that I keep in this tank, all of them have their stomata, these little openings where they release oxygen on the top side of the leaves. So for species that have them on the underside of the leaf, they're going to be pumping oxygen into the tank. These guys are putting oxygen into the air that we breathe, so still a good thing in my opinion. Aesthetics, if you keep an open top tank, I think it's really fun to have at least a little patch of floating plants. They just provide like that extra aesthetic when you're looking on top of a tank instead of just having a clean barren surface. So the one last pro that I think of when keeping floating plants is evaporation. So especially if you live in a really dry area like I do, you can lose up to 10% of the water volume on an open top tank, especially if it's a longer one, within 1 week. So these floating plants really help to reduce that evaporation rate. Let's talk about some cons of keeping floating plants. So a lot of the cons are directly related to the pros. Like for one, they grow really quickly, which is good in the sense that it uptakes nutrients, but bad in the sense that you're going to have to do a lot of manual removal of these floating plants. And certain species like everyone's favorite duckweed in particular can really take over the top of a tank. In fact, when you add duckweed into a tank, it's almost impossible to get rid of. So one problem that can arise when keeping floaters is that they will just literally cover the whole top of the aquarium. And that kind of relates to the whole maintenance aspect. But a negative side to that for the inhabitants of your tank is if you have fish that like to go to the surface to breathe, they're going to have a hard time. Like a betta likes to go up to the top. So it's important to make sure you don't keep too many of them, that you are removing them. And then, if you have that many, it's going to block out light, which is not going to allow your plants to survive. So you do need to find kind of a middle ground when keeping floating plants. If you're using a hang on back filter, they can drop water onto the floating plants, which push them under, and then they can get sucked into the filter intake, which obviously is not a good thing. So, there is some potential for floating plants to cause a mess. You do need to keep your eye on them. One last con for floating plants is that there's potential for cross contamination of pests. So, normally aquatic plants don't have any terrestrial component, and they're not going to pick up aphids or thrips or some other stuff that may be able to go back and forth between your house plants. Okay, let's talk about my 3 favorite species of floating plants for the aquarium. First one, dwarf water lettuce. It's this beefy leafed one over here. It's such a fun looking plant. It does a really good job at providing habitat because of how far down these roots grow. You can see them coming down to about here, and they'd actually grow all the way down to the bottom, but every 2 or 3 months I come through and I trim all those roots because I don't like them spreading everywhere. But it is important to have some of them because that's where the nutrients are uptaken from, and that also provides such good habitat for the fish to be swimming in and out of. They get frisky and do their spawning behavior there. Such a great component of this plant. In the wild, it can be found growing pretty much on every continent. There's some argument about where it's native to. I read both South America and Africa, but clearly it's been introduced to every corner of the world. It grows in slow moving waters like uh, canals and streams, ponds, lakes. And if you look really closely, you'll see little flowers growing on some of them. This plant does need substantial light to grow those big, beefy, succulent like leaves. If you grow them in a lower light setting, like this tank here, which has tons of nutrients, it reproduces all the time, but without the light, it's never going to grow those huge, chunky leaves like we got in this tank here. So, if you want to get the most out of this plant, you'll want to use somewhat strong lighting. All right, my second favorite floating plant is Salvinia natans. This plant is native to the old world, so it can be found growing across Europe, Africa, Asia. It's got some really cool leaves. You see these little hairs sticking out of them. They make kind of like a spiky appearance, but you got to look close to kind of appreciate the small details for this one. The roots don't grow quite as far down as the dwarf water lettuce, but you still get some good activity, maybe this far down from the water surface. One thing that I find really fascinating about this plant is that it's actually a floating fern. So I don't know why I get such a kick out of that. It's not like, it's not like it's some magic plant or anything. It's just a floating fern, but um, so different from what I think of as a fern. These guys are a little bit more sensitive than water lettuce or duckweed, for example. They need a little bit more light, a little more nutrients, and when it comes to strong flow, that will just decimate them. They're also sensitive to high levels of humidity and stagnant air. So if you have a tank with a lid on it, like a Fluval Flex, make sure that you keep that feeding door open so that you can get some airflow in there. Otherwise, it will accumulate some mold and mildew, and they'll start to die off, which will add bad stuff to your tank. Fish start eating mold and mildew, they can get sick. This species looks very similar to Salvinia minima, which is another common floating plant for the aquarium industry. The only difference that I can tell is that the Salvinia natans leaves almost grow like little tacos. They'll kind of form up a little bit, whereas Salvinia minima, the leaves always grow flat along the surface of the water. Last but not least, everyone's favorite, duckweed. Duckweed is a very, very fast growing plant. It grows aggressively and can totally take over the top of a tank. There are many species of it across the world. It's a very diverse family of plants. In North America, what we see in most aquariums is Lemna minor. And if you live in Europe or Asia or Africa or somewhere else, who knows what you're seeing in your tank? You might have different native species there. But this is the kind of plant where if you're not sure that you want it, don't buy it. Don't buy anything that has duckweed in the tank, because once it enters a tank, it's almost impossible to get rid of. It just it grows so quickly, and there are these little tiny specks that just like get stuck in the tiniest nooks and crannies, and if you miss one or two of them, they will quickly reproduce and take over the top of your tank in no time. So duckweed is an excellent plant when it comes to absorbing nutrients. I think it's superior to all the other floating plants solely because of how fast it reproduces. Like nothing reproduces this quick. You can sit there and look at it and it's like boing, boing, boing. It's just spitting out little buds here and there. Um, I do like using it on like fry grow out tanks because it absorbs so much nutrients, blocks the light out, creates a perfect condition for raising little baby fish. If you only want that floating plant on a tank, then it's also a good one to use. But if you want to mix it with other species, I advise caution. If you look at this tank here, you can see that it's kind of choking out some of the Salvinia natans. So yeah, I'm actually going to remove it now. And this is how I spend my Saturday morning. The third time I've tried to remove duckweed from this tank. What you got to do is basically pull all the floating plants and then make sure you really rinse off the non-duckweeds to get all the duckweed off, and then plop them back in the tank. I'm going to put the duckweed in this Cory Fry grow out tank because it'll help keep the water clean. When it comes to disposal of your floating plants, I would strongly suggest that you just dump them outside on your grass or compost pile or under a tree or something. What you don't want happening is these to enter a stream or pond or something, because they can really take over and mess up an ecosystem. If there's already native floating plants that live there or species that require light from the surface, then you can really alter things. All right, some tips and tricks on growing floating plants. It's really not that hard for the most part. All you got to do is toss them in a tank and they'll take over. But they are sensitive to a few things. So I've already mentioned that they need a lot of nutrients. So even if you measure the nutrients in your water column and you're not seeing any in there, but your plants are doing well, chances are what's happening is as the fish produce waste, the plants are consuming it immediately, and that leaves the water column clear. Something else that they're sensitive to is flow. If you have high levels of flow, that can really destroy some of the floating plants. Sometimes what happens is, one leaf will get caught and then the flow will push them over. They'll get flipped upside down, then they'll get pushed under, then they'll just start rotting and putting some ammonia in your tank, and that's no good either. Like I mentioned before, overcrowding and airflow, they're both kind of related. If you don't have any airflow in your tank, you can get some mold and mildew. That's not very good. The last cool thing about floating plants is that they're kind of a canary in a coal mine. They grow so fast, they have quick life cycles, and as a result, they can do really well very quickly, but also can do very poorly in the blink of an eye. So if you see your floating plants are dying off all of a sudden, that means that something in your tank is changing. Maybe they don't have enough nutrients, or all of a sudden there's lack of airflow. And if there's no airflow for those plants, then likely your fish aren't going to get enough oxygen. So it's important to note how your floating plants are doing. If they're doing poorly, then address that change before something negatively impacts the other plants in your aquarium or your livestock. Floating plants are such an amazing type of plant. They are a true powerhouse. They'll help keep your tank clean and provide excellent dynamic habitat for your fish. Well, let me know, what's your favorite floating plant? What do you use at home? Do you absolutely love duckweed, or do you hate it? Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed today's video, please go ahead, hit that like, subscribe, all that stuff. All of us YouTubers say it, but it really does help support my channel when you interact with it in some way. Most of all, go watch some other videos. Got tons of fun builds. Thanks so much for watching. Till next time, see ya.